Vigini Studio, we teach old European decorative technique with modern medium. Hi, I'm Nicola Vigini. I was born in Rome, Italy, and I've been practicing decorative artists for over 20 years. Whether it be mural, grottesca, or trompe-l'oeil, as a designer and teacher, I try and I combine all elements of decoration to create an overall unique effect. Remember, becoming an artist is not defined by talent, but rather a strong desire to improve combined with repetition. This is the red Pompeian finish. It's a flat latex paint base coat, and then I have my Venetian Plaster tinted with red oxide. Now I use a stipple brush. I prefer for this kind of work a modern synthetic brush for the application of plaster because it doesn't damage the air, the fine air of a traditional stipple brush. I apply again randomly all over the surface using a twist movement to avoid the repetition of the same mark of application. And I'm using a stippler to create a light tooth, which will help the process of the successive layer of plaster. Now for the next layer, we're taking 50% of the same tinted Venetian plaster with red oxide, and we're mixing it with 50% of lime putty. Lime putty is the traditional component of lime plaster. When you mix the two together, you also add a little bit of water. Lime tends to dry the plaster out. So this is generally, it's a little bit of a messy technique. The plaster crumbles a little bit, but like you will see, it's part of our process. Otherwise, the technique is a standard Venetian plaster technique, a little material at a time on the blade, and then we apply over the surface. With medium pressure, we want to build this plaster a little bit thicker and a little heavier than the traditional Venetian plaster. But we're applying always with a skip trowel motion. And now we're going to let this layer dry. The surface is now dry, and we're ready to start to apply the next layer. Again, a skip trowel over the darker area. Now you can see that how much lighter the plaster is this time. That's because the lime makes the plaster dry much lighter. So actually it's easier to see the area where we want to apply our plaster. And of course you're going to overlap over the previous layer, cover all the area that they are now in dark red. Again, medium pressure. I try to make sure that in some area I push really tight the plaster, like in a traditional Venetian plaster, while in other area I build the plaster thicker, so that's where you will see in the successive layer will crack and pull off. I'm always looking for a really uneven application. Again, this plaster is supposed to represent an aged plaster has been cracked all over the years. So that way I get this random pattern all over the surface. Now we're ready to let it dry. Now the surface is dry. You can see that it dries much lighter because, like we said earlier, the lime caused the plaster to dry much whiter. Also, in the thicker area, you can see that some cracks start to appear. That's also, it's part of the reason why we're using the lime. Next things, we're going to glaze this surface. Now, one thing you really have to understand, compare a regular glazing process. Here you're working over a traditional plaster at this point. The lime makes the surface very matte and very absorbent. So the glaze will absorb very fast, which makes it quite difficult. To deal with that, there is two things you can do. One is you can wet the surface. You can use a sprayer or work with a sponge and some water. Also, you want to work in small section at a time and overlapping your stroke. So now we're getting ready to do that. I first use water. You can also let it drip down. It doesn't really cause any problem. This is the technique that is commonly used also to glaze exterior stucco building when the surface is also a plaster, and it will absorb very fast. And then here I have a glaze, which is mixed 50% glaze, 50% water, and then my pigment are red oxide, burnt sienna, and a little bit of cadmium red. And now I'm applying with the brush in crisscross motion. And I immediately take my brush, my sponge, and break up the surface, especially the edges. That's what I describe as a dry edge technique. And it works really well every time you use a fast drying medium or an absorbent surface. I overlap over the previous area. And again, with a wet sponge, I break up the surface so I avoid heavy brush marks. Because of the quality of the lime and the absorbent surface, it's hard to see what you're doing as the surface is still wet. So we have to let it dry, and sometimes we decide to reinforce this process with a second layer of glaze. Okay, now the surface is dry. You can see that the plaster has absorbed the glaze in an uneven way, which gives us already a very interesting and aged surface. Now I'm going to apply my stencil. And then I need to always have a little bit of masking tape after under the registration marks, so I can use a pencil, not directly on the plaster. Then I mark my corners. And I'm ready to go with my stencil. I'm using a little bit of paper to discharge the brush. You don't want a brush that's too loaded with paint once you start to stencil. And I prefer almost like a dry brush technique, so I don't apply too much paint to the surface. Okay, we're done now with this first, the number one. We have 3 overlay stencil in this case. Okay, here we are. This is step number 2, the second overlay stencil. We're going to go over our registration marks. And then we continue the same process. Dry brush with our stencil brush. The beauty of working over a traditional plaster-based surface is that we don't need to create a lot of variation on the glaze level or on the stencil level, because the way how the surface absorbs the paint create that naturally. So just by dry brush this way, the plaster will absorb unevenly on the surface the paint, and it will give us a lot of interesting variation. We're now done with the number 2. We can remove it again. And let it dry until the next step. Now we are here at the number 3, which is our final layer. Again, always overlapping precisely with our registration marks. And here we're done with the final step. Now the stencil is dry. So far we've been using the stencil to basically transfer the image to the surface. This is a work that traditionally I would have done with what I call the pouncing pattern, transfer with charcoal the image and then fill in freehand this basic medium color. Obviously the stencil helps us to speed up the process a lot. Now we need to talk about a little bit of grisaille principle, which means also shadow and light. This yellow background, which is made of yellow ochre and raw sienna, represent what we call the middle tone. Now I mix a new color, which is this color plus white, to do what I call the highlight. To do that, we have to consider where the light source is coming from. It's a conventional choice, so I decided it comes from the upper left corner in this case. I'm using 2 different size brush, a small and a slightly larger one, so I don't have to use more strokes when I get into larger area. Also in this technique, I'm trying to imitate the traditional Roman Pompeian technique. It was a very quick technique. Some people even describe it as impressionistic. So even if it follows the rule of trompe-l'oeil and realism in the direction of shadow and light, it's very synthetic. And so the speed and the security of brush stroke is very important. So the light comes from the upper left corner. I see this small shape, for example, as a small round object, so I highlight the top. And I stop generally in the middle of the surface. The leaves, I conventionally paint them either on one side or just the tip of the leaf. Now, same type of shape, but larger one, and switch to the larger brush. Also, it's good rules to start to paint from the left side if you're a right-hand person, and move lower right side, so you don't touch your surface that it's wet. You will notice also that these layers, it's a little more opaque. The white makes opaque paint, while our middle tone and the shadow color will be transparent. That's also, it's a very traditional technique. The highlight are always opaque while the shadow are transparent. There is no blending whatsoever in this type of technique. The transition between the highlight and the shadow, I mean the middle tone and the middle tone to the shadow, are defined by sharp lines. We have to pay particular attention to the face. Little round stroke for the hair. And then we focus on all the point of the face that usually catch the highlight, always coming from one side to the other. So the front will be lighter, and then the cheeks, very important, and the nose. Above the eyes, always on one side. Sometimes in some of the larger area, I use a smaller brush and I do a cross-hatching effect just to give a little more vibration and variation to the surface. And here we are. This is the first step with the highlight that it's completed. Now we're going to wait until it's dry and we'll move to the shadow. Okay, now the highlight is dry and I took the original color, raw sienna, yellow ochre, our middle tone, and now add some raw umber for the shadow color and also some burnt sienna because this gold warm color, I want the shadow to remain somewhat warm. So now I'm ready to apply my shadow layer. And again, I'm following the same direction. And generally speaking, I'm applying the highlight on the opposite, the shadow in the opposite direction of the highlight. So again, little stroke under the highlight. Now the secret on this layer is to be very light-handed. I have a very delicate, small ornamentation. And technically speaking, when we do grisaille, we always have to have the three-tone, middle tone, highlight, and shadow. In many areas here, it's difficult to have space for all three of those tones. So it's very dangerous to reduce the entire image to highlight and shadow. We'll lose the luminosity, the rich depth of the original color. So we try to be very light-handed and to have short stroke with the shadow color. Sometimes in some of the leaf area, I apply just on one side and on another for variation purpose. Again, I don't want to have this shadow color spread all over the place. Underneath this little petal of the flower, so it makes the front popping out. And again, the face is very important. How we can define the eye better. Underneath the nose, mouth. You can start to appear, to see the figure, the face to appear. Again, larger brush for larger area. A decorative painter is very important to gain speed every time it's possible. And here we're done. This is the second layer with the shadow, and now we're ready to let it dry and start the real antiquing process. Now the decorative work is done, it's dry, and we are ready to polish the surface and also to distress the image. Our plaster now is soft in some of the area. Where the crackle are, the thicker area will crack and pull off. So here we are. We're going to start with the classical motion that we use to burnish the Venetian plaster. And we start to put more pressure. And you can see that the plaster start to pull off. So we can target all the area that they are heavier. And you see that we are creating all this really convincing age effect. The paint pull off like old plaster and reveals the lighter color underneath. Also, if you look from the side, you can start to see the sheen of Venetian plaster that builds us up. And according to how much pressure you're putting on the surface, you can get more or less out. So you can really be in control of this process. Okay, at this point, we're done. We can take some sandpaper. Sometimes I like to wear it off a little bit, so the tube is a little bit lighter. It's 220 sandpaper. And I can go in detail. Right now we have stronger area where the plaster have been chipping off, and with the sandpaper I can actually soft some more details. We sand randomly all over the surface. Be sure that when you sand, you don't sand only the image, but also the red background around, so the edge look more natural and uniform. Now we're ready for the final antique glaze. And like before, every time we want to glaze a plaster surface, we want to get it slightly humid or wet. So I'm using again my sponge. Plus we've been sanding, so it's nice to remove some of the leftover from the sanding process. That allows me to see better the image also. And here I have a glaze with I add always 50% water, raw umber pigment, a little bit of burnt umber, and I'm getting ready to glaze on the surface. Again, kind of a random application. And I have some denatured alcohol here, which I'm going to sprinkle all over the surface. And then again, I come back with the sponge and kind of break up some of the shape. And I finish with my light badgering. Also, if I find some area heavier, I can always still wet, so I can kind of wipe off and lift some of the area, maybe around the face, some of the smaller detail, so they don't get lost. And now I'm going to let it dry. Now we're ready for the last layer. We're going to apply an oil-based wax. This is a very important step for two reasons. The first is that surface with lime dries matte. The wax brings back the depth. And in this image, that it's very dark color is very important. The second is it's part of our imitation process. We're trying to imitate the Roman technique of plaster and fresco painting. And that was their typical final process. They actually use a real wax to finish all their finishes. So here we are, I'm putting the wax on a rag and applying it all over the surface. I start with an application with a rag because it's much faster. You push it everywhere very fast, like in a classical furniture type of application. And then I come back with a trowel or also a Japan blade, and I try to focus on all the crevices and the cracks. And so I literally trowel the wax on. And now the wax starts to catch us in all the little details of the plaster. And that's, again, is very important because when it dries, it will add something to the overall finish. Now it's done. We're going to wait until it's dry, and then we're ready to polish the wax. The wax now is ready to be buffed. It's still drying deep in the crevices, but you can already see appearing some of the white frost. It's a really beautiful effect that I really particularly like in this finish, but it will be complete tomorrow morning when all the deeper part will be totally dry. But for now, we're ready to, I'm using the same cotton rag, and I can put pressure on the surface and buff the wax. You can start to see the red coming back, deeper color. Also, I like to use the trowel again, sort of in the same effect. It's buffing the wax and it's also burnishing the plaster once again. And here we are. This is the complete finish. Now we're going to have an overview of the red Pompeian plaster. We start first by stippling our synthetic plaster, let it dry, and then mix the same plaster with natural lime putty. We apply the lime putty and the plaster in 2 layers, like a traditional Venetian plaster, and we let that dry. Then we mix our red glaze and apply the glaze over the entire surface. Let the glaze dry, and then we start our stencil process, which is composed of 3 overlay stencils. After the stencil was finished, we had complete what we call our middle tone. Now we're ready to start to do the highlight and the shadow. We did the highlight first and then following by the shadow. Finish that, we let it dry, and we apply our antiquing brown glaze. Then we're ready to start the burnishing process. In this case, burnishing the surface means also to scrape off. That's how we create all the plaster that chip off and the image that is aged. After doing that, we're finally ready to apply the wax. We're applying the wax, we let it dry, and then we first polish with a cotton rag, and finally we come back with a trowel and we burnish the surface again. This is one of many in our series of DVD. For more information, check Vigini Studio at viginistudio.com. Thank you for watching and good luck with your work.